go ahead.
Okay, great.
Maybe I just start by quickly formally introducing you, Mirabelle. Mirabelle is an assistant professor in economics at the Imperial College Business School, and she was a lecturer at the Grantham Institute until recently. Mirabelle is the program director of the MSc Climate Change Management and Finance, and she's also a research associate in the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics. Her current research focuses on the economics of climate change, seeking to understand the impact of climate change policies and climate change on firms' emissions, energy efficiency, innovation, competitiveness, and performance. She is also interested in understanding domestic energy consumption behavior. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And as I said, thanks for inviting me. So I'll share my slides maybe too. Okay, that seems correct. So today I'll present a research project that I've been running with a few colleagues and in collaboration with a company called Octopus Energy. And it's the title is Homeworking and Energy Consumption, Evidence from the UK Lockdown During COVID-19. So we're all hopefully looking to a post-COVID world where there's been a lot of talk, whether in policy or in research, about what is the new normal going to be post-COVID. And we all remember seeing the maps of pollution over China or Europe or everywhere in the world falling drastically. And this is a graph that shows energy total electricity load across peak hours in different countries, and this massive fall in March and April. And we see it took a long time to recover, and I've cut here before the second wave and other waves here. And so it has brought up in the policy world really at least willingness, and most recently expressed this week in the G7, to relaunch the economy in a better way, hopefully. So even if on aggregate we see that nothing has changed and we're back to same levels of pollution and consumption, it might not mean that nothing has changed. And so on the one hand, in particular when thinking about where we're working and how we work, the implications of what we've experienced in the past year and a half nearly is going to be informing us about the future. And so one is in terms of at the firm level, a lot of firms have been pledging net zero, but when employees are working at home, it sort of starts changing the boundaries of the firm. And in thinking about net zero, where are firms going to be defining what net zero is, and is this a new margin of action by firms to reduce their emissions? And then another thing that changes is, even if the aggregate electricity or gas or energy consumption doesn't change, what do we learn from when during the day we consume electricity or energy, and how will that this new sort of asynchronicity, how will that affect load profile? So as researchers, we're always keen to find good settings to answer questions, and the first lockdown brought us a good occasion to try and see forward into the future what life could look like if more people were working from home. And so we were lucky to be able to partner up with Octopus Energy. So Octopus are a rising energy provider in the UK who have built a business model on a better connection with their customers, and in particular through a very advanced data platform and data science based approach to energy provision as a service versus just provision of the actual energy. So it's more, they see it more as a service where the customer is more central, and all based on fully renewable and being part of the transition. So I'm not meaning to do any marketing for them, but I think very interesting. We were talking about corporates earlier. Interesting people to listen to in their views and their business model. I encourage you to do that. So anyway, they were very kind to be keen to partner up with us, and so it went in two ways. So first, they provided us with consent, obviously, from their customers, with individual half-hourly energy consumption, so gas and electricity, when they provide both, for about close to 1,200 customers. They are all residential customers, and they had been, we selected those that had been for a long time their customers, so that we had data for 2019 and 2020. And of those 1,200 customers who agreed to share their data, about 452 responded to a survey that we built, where we were specifically asking about teleworking before and before the pandemic and during the first lockdown. So everything I'll tell you today is relative to the first lockdown, and we stop our analysis on the 1st of July 2020. It's particularly so I'll tell you about what our approach is. So we we use the lockdown as a natural experiment, which, because the first lockdown was so strict, it's easier to analyze than the later lockdowns, where children were back at school in the second lockdown, and the third lockdown, where there were more key workers still working from the office, etc. So we combine smart meter data. We also add some demographics data, and then the survey data for those 400 households that reply to it. And that gives us a very comprehensive insight into what was happening in those households, which is also the reason why we focus on the first lockdown, because the questions they answered were about the first lockdown. They answered, this survey was run over the summer last year. So the smart meter data is for 2019 and 2020. We have it at the half-hour level for gas and electricity, and then I won't present much on that, but Octopus also provided us with the aggregated regional level half-hourly data, so that we could check if our sample was more or less representative of their wider customer base, which we show it was. And so the survey was, as I said, we invited 9,000 customers by email to fill in the survey, and a significant number agreed to share their data, but about half of those answered the more detailed questions about what they do, etc. So what we asked them many things about their work habits, their commute mode, how do they usually go to work, how many children are in the household, and more specifically, how many days they worked from home and from the office before and during lockdown. So that gave us a good control of that. And then we also asked them, so this is more for illustration, how they changed their activities during lockdown. And so obviously, there was more gardening, more online buying, more cooking. Netflix and other streaming platforms clearly did well, as we know, watching entertainment, and then less public transport, private car use, etc. There wasn't a feeling that they were using more air conditioning or more heating overall, or on average. So what we also measured was, and we can see here, is how the teleworking patterns changed during lockdown. And it's obvious that the blue one is working full-time from home, and this increased strongly. But what you see from here is that and those who didn't telework at all before lockdown, there's 42% of them, and only 12% so these are likely to be key workers who kept going to work. But then even before lockdown, you see that there was already a significant number of people who would work 1, 2, 3 days a week from home. And these then worked much more from home afterwards. So, I guess we would all be good examples of people who moved from probably here to the blue. So of course, our sample is likely to be slightly biased towards populations that are more likely to telework. One is because if they were taking the time to fill the survey, it could be because they were not in a hospital looking after people, but at their computer filling a survey. But and there could be other reasons which we try to control for. But what's interesting is that we have quite a wide variation in the people's behavior who are part of our data set. So if you look at aggregate UK electricity and gas use during lockdown, given the huge economic impact of it decreased significantly. That was my first graph. So that it would be too narrow to say let's only look at what's happening at home, because what happened on the aggregate scale was a clear drop in energy use linked to a clear drop in economic activity and all the negative sides of that. But if we only look at the residential side, it's obvious that what we're expecting is an increase in energy use from home. And this is what we see if we look just at the density plot. We see that electricity consumption increased and gas consumption increased. And so the way that economists like to try to measure that is through regression analysis. So what we did is that we ran regressions looking at how electricity and gas consumption at different time aggregations varied during lockdown. So, although we have half-hourly data, we compare within a household, so not aggregate for all households, but within a whole household, we compare before and after how much electricity they consumed, and we control for the week of the year. So we're going to be comparing the 14th week of 2020, which was a lockdown week, to the 14th week in 2019 for the same customer. Okay, and so what we find when we do that at the week level, we find that electricity increased by 10%. If we look at the working week, it was 13%, and the weekend consumption was only 6.9%. And then if we compare day for day, so the 150th day to the 150th day for the same customer in 2020 or 2019, then there we find a 12% consumption, and then we can even go deeper and control for comparing hour to hour, and we see a 13% increase. Okay, and in all of those we control for temperature, because you might remember it was a quite warm spring, and so if electricity is known to depend on weather, for many different reasons, heating, lighting, kettles on, and so that's why we control for hourly temperature at the postcode level. Okay, and then surprisingly, when we do it for gas, and this is still work in progress, we find that gas consumption decreased even when we control for temperature. And so we're exploring right now what is driving this effect of gas decrease, and we've come up with a few potential reasons. Maybe you'll think of some more. One, it could be that people cook differently. So maybe they for big families, instead of having several meals, there's just one meal, but it's still surprising. Another potential thing we thought is that people showered less. So because they were not exercising as much or not going out as much, they would shower less and therefore use less hot water and therefore use less gas. That's another potential explanation. And then, or just the temperature controls we are using in our regression are not good enough, and so we're trying to redo the analysis more specifically. And so you see that on the working week level, there's not much of a change, but that when we look at the weekend, the decrease is of 15%, the week, and that's what's driving it. But even at the day level or hour level, there are some decreases. So we're still exploring that. So those are like big overall figures. But what we were interested in, and linked to what I was telling you before of understanding the flexibility within the day, we were interested in looking at day level consumption. And in particular, because if we fast forward, what we want as an energy system in the future in a net zero world is probably one where we're more flexible in our energy use, and we're ready to consume off peak to make sure that there's a lower level of emissions. And it's often seen as one solution of the many to lead the system there. And so when you look at the profile of energy use, so you have electricity use on the left and gas consumption on the right, and different colors are the different days of the week, and the weekend consumption is the top two ones. So less of the working day dip on weekends, and this is for gas. So you can see gas use increases earlier during weekdays. So you wake up earlier basically, and so you take showers and heat your house earlier during weekdays. So this is not a new graph, but it just illustrates that in our data we are looking at people who have quite typical consumption patterns in terms of gas and electricity. And so again, when we compared hourly consumption overall for 2019 and 2020, we see that during lockdown electricity increased, but it increased mostly in the middle of the day, and the peak consumption was shifted to slightly earlier times of the day, whereas the early mornings. So when we saw these shifts in hourly profile, and here also for gas, a decrease at the start of the day but an increase in the middle of the day, we were keen to go deeper and see better what that meant. And so what we did is, not only were we keen to understand how consumption changed, but also for electricity, how did the carbon content and cost of electricity change within the day. And so to measure that, we did two things. So first, I'm going to go back and forth a slide so that we can see that. So what I showed you earlier was that lockdown implied a 10% increase in electricity consumption. But if we then compute for each half hour the carbon intensity of that half hour in 2020, so during lockdown, and the cost of that to produce electricity in that half hour, we find that actually the weekly electricity emissions in 2020 and weekly electricity costs in 2020 fell by 6.7 and 5.4%. And the reason for that is composed of two elements. So the first reason why, even though you consume more as a household, you decrease your electricity-induced carbon emissions, the first reason can be that, what I showed you is that you're consuming less at peak hours and more during the day when the wind is blowing. And if it was just that one reason, that would be a very strong finding, saying, it's all we need to do to really, to do is to shift our consumption, and that will reduce our emissions while still being able to consume more electricity. However, the second reason why your electricity consumption driven emissions can decrease is that the whole grid is less carbon intensive. And the reason why the grid was less carbon intensive in a significant way during lockdown was, one, that there was overall less electricity demand, and so the grid was less in need of firing up gas turbines. And the reason why there was less demand is that there was less economic activity. So it's not something good. We want to have everyone furloughed so that the grid is less carbon intensive. So it's the combination. And the second reason was that it was a very sunny spring and quite windy, and so there were more renewables in the system. And so it's the combination of those two reasons that leads to this shift, this difference between a 10% increase in electricity consumption but a 6% decrease in electricity emissions. And so to disentangle this sort of behavioral shift of when I'm consuming from the systemic change of the energy, the carbon content of the grid, what we did is that we measured each household's weekly electricity-driven emissions, but instead of using 2020, so the same hour, the actual hour of at which the electricity is consumed, we use the carbon content of the grid in 2019. Okay, so that we isolate in this measure electricity emissions that we call 2019. We isolate the behavior effect. So you have the equation up here, if you like equations. The electricity emissions that we call 2019 are the actual 2020 electricity consumption in a given half hour, but that we multiply and then aggregate, we multiply by the carbon intensity in 2019. And when we do that, we see that the electricity emissions increased, not by as much as 10%. So there was a behavioral shift that meant that the increase in electricity emissions was only 7%, but it definitely didn't decrease. And in terms of cost, the cost increase was the same. Cost of production, it is. So any question on that? No? So, you know, I'll go back now to show you on the graph what that meant is, it means that while the electricity consumption, and so what it means is that you cannot only rely on behavior change. If you think of the future and you say, okay, electricity demand has to be more flexible, we have to spread it out during the day and avoid the peaks. That is true, it will contribute, but it's not enough. You do need a systemic change where your whole grid is being invested in and more renewables are being invested in, so that the whole grid becomes also. So energy demand flexibility is only one tiny part of what needs to happen with in combination with the bigger grid. And so, you know, what we did is we compared, to see that graphically, what we did is we compared the energy, the gas, and on this side the electricity consumption during lockdown and outside lockdown, but compared to the average. So you see here the average consumption outside lockdown was lower than during lockdown in blue, but not only, although the average was higher, you see that compared to the average, what you consumed during the day was different, so at different times of the day. So as I said earlier, the peak was earlier, and the households would tend to consume more in the middle of the day than they did outside lockdown. And for gas, what we see is that the morning and evening peak of gas consumption were much flatter, but that there was an increase in the middle of the day. As I said, gas we're still looking at. The shift in the gas is important, but has less direct impacts on emissions, because, you know, the carbon content of the gas you're burning is the same at different times of the day. So there's less margin on, you know, how behavior can affect gas, except if you start thinking, but this wasn't the case in this situation. You're starting, okay, maybe I heat a flat earlier in the day so that the flat is already heated, and when I come back at peak time, I don't have to be heating. Then my flat or house is a sort of battery of energy. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you is that if we go back to the question of teleworking and the impact on total emissions, is you know, if we only look at it from an energy perspective and not from a work productivity or well-being question, we were keen to see what would be the what is the impact of staying at home on your energy consumption. And so what we did to try and measure that is that we used the information we had in terms of commuting mode, and we also asked people how far they would commute pre-lockdown. So for each household, and there were up to 5 adults in the different households, we asked them, what is your transport mode? So you can see the most frequent one is a petrol private car, and then diesel and public transport are the next 2 important ones. And walking, electric or hybrid or bicycle are really a minority. And then we asked about travel distance, and you see that the distance is usually quite small, but with some range. And so, not surprisingly, once only looking at household electricity and gas consumption is only a small part of your energy consumption. The commute for a sample that has a lot of petrol and diesel cars and even public transport it has an important dimension we have to take into account. So what we did is we computed for each household their what we call household carbon emissions as the emissions that came from their consumption of electricity, but using 2019 emissions content of electricity. And then we added gas, but the gas carbon content is fixed during the day. And then we summed for every adult in the household the number of days they would commute times the carbon content of their mode of commute, which is estimated by the Department of Transport, and times, twice their travel distance. Okay. And so what is missing here is how much energy they were using in the office. So we tried to do that in the survey, but we weren't convinced about our measure. It's, I don't know about you, but it would be very hard for me to know how much my office at Imperial consumes in terms of energy. And so we try to use different metrics that are in some of the ONS publications about size of the building, how many office workers there are in your office. But we decided it was too approximative to be used. So here what I'm going to show you is only taking commute and home emissions, energy-linked emissions. And so what we find is that lockdown decreased household emissions by 30%. These household emissions as I define them. But then, so then we started thinking, okay, so, that's quite a significant number, but of these 30%, how much are due to actually teleworking? So, if I think of my own household, I had 4 kids who were on their remote schooling. The TV was probably on a bit more. We were on weekends, you would usually go out, you are more at home. So there's a lot of this decrease in household emissions that is linked to not only teleworking, but the fact that there is someone at home or there are people at home. So what we did is we used the data that told us exactly, how many people were there before lockdown, during lockdown, and what were they doing to actually measure that a teleworking day reduces household emissions by 5%, and the rest, the other 24%, are driven by actually being at home and having a household at home. And we see that in terms of, we then decompose it between electricity and gas emissions. And so we find that the teleworking, not only it reduces our emissions, and the main driver of this of these 5% is actually the commute and not the the change in behavior of electricity demand. So then what we asked also people, and this sort of joins a broader debate that I touched on, is fine, everyone works at home, we close down all offices and that's it. But there's clearly, I'm, to be honest, quite looking forward to seeing my colleagues again, and I think many of us think we'll be more productive on some aspects by being in an office. And so we can't do the exercise well, because here, this is just one subsample, but what you want to be measuring is, how far are people commuting? How are they commuting? Because if I'm in an electric train and that electricity is from renewables, then surely, my commute, which we saw clearly influences the gain in emissions from teleworking, is in existence, and in addition, maybe my office is more energy efficient than my home. And so while our findings are this decrease in emissions from teleworking, when you put it in the bigger picture, full teleworking is probably not a solution you want to put as a major driver of emissions. And so what we also asked is these people, after lockdown, how many days a week would you be willing to telework from your experience? And so there we saw that on average, people would answer 3 days a week would be their ideal teleworking. So taking into account, impact on energy, impact on commute, energy efficiency of offices, and preferences, and maybe worker productivity, you might come to a more flexible system of teleworking, but even from a carbon perspective, not a full teleworking. A better optimization of that would be my takeaway. So to conclude, what do we find? We find that weekly electricity usage during lockdown increased by 10%. The production cost and carbon emission costs were reduced, but mostly because the whole system's carbon content during lockdown was lower. Household carbon emissions decreased by 30%, but once we decompose the behavioral and the systemic approach, the system-wide change in carbon content, then the behavioral response only has a small part to play. I think it's not disappointing, but you would think, if even such a massive change in your behavior, so I can't think of any bigger change in behavior we've had to gone through than lockdown, only led to a small behavioral change of your electricity, then it really puts forward the need for more systemic change, and that behavior is important, but needs to be incentivized and thought about carefully. And so, then focusing on, what was the impact of teleworking, we find that 1 day a week reduces carbon emissions of the household by 5%, mostly through the non-commute. So cleaning up transport is also an important way further. And then I think, a more general thing is for companies, it is a question of how can I take into account, when thinking of net zero pledges by companies, I think the teleworking linked to lockdown has put has shown that you need to take that into account when thinking of a company's carbon footprint, your office, but also your employees' commute and maybe home emissions when home working. So thanks, and thank you for listening. I'll stop sharing actually.
Thank you, Mirabelle. A question about heating, because clearly the gas consumption was a big part of the carbon footprint. And looking ahead at the future of heating, if we go in the expected direction towards much more electrical heating, there though it would be heat pumps, and they tend to operate on a steady state, so very differently. So you wouldn't have the big ramp up in the morning. You might have them going down a bit at night, but it would be very different.
Yeah.
What do you think about that change?
Well, I think heating is really under-researched area, because, and I think it's driven a bit by the fact that in the US, if you think of residential emissions, they are often driven by air conditioning, because it's such a heavy demand of electricity in many parts of the US. And so a lot of the research in behavioral energy demand has been around that, and less on heating. And so I think, well, I'm not an expert in heat pumps, so I'm not sure, but what would be your guess that there wouldn't be a sort of opportunity to smooth anything, would there?
Well, I think there would be a smoothing that would come through the heat pump itself, perhaps. I mean, there was alarm at first when people started thinking about electrifying heating. I mean, look at how steep the ramp up is in the morning. And if you were using as much electricity as we're now using gas for heating, and if it was going up the demand that steeply in the morning, then the system simply couldn't cope with it. But if you have a heat pump, that's much slower response to controls. And so my understanding is they operate most effectively when you keep them on a fairly steady temperature.
Okay, interesting.
But it means that people have a different relationship with their heating, because it isn't just, I feel cold, I'll turn up the heating.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen like that. It's much more that you get used to being a similar temperature all the time.
So I don't know. I mean, that's why we're still looking at it and trying to understand whether this decrease in gas that we saw during our survey or our period of study, whether could it be due to people not turning on and off their thermostat and just getting used to the temperature, or I don't know.
Anecdotally, there seems to have been a lot of, I don't shower as much as I used to. I smell more, because who cares?
Well, I think so. That's what we're trying. Using our data, we're trying to see when there were within a day bigger variations. So looking at the maximum temperature and the lowest temperature within a day, then maybe your heating behavior is different. And because you're at home, you're acting differently. So we're trying to control for that. And then we're trying to look at those that that have electric heating, because that we know from the survey, and compare those to those that only have gas heating, and see if we find something different there. But I don't know yet. We're still looking at that.
Our colleague Sam Hampton did some nice work on people working from home, some qualitative work, and he found that when people were working from home, they were more conscious about their heating. And for example, they would do things like wrapping a blanket around themselves and keeping the heating low.
Interesting.
They thought about it more.
So who did that research?
He's called Sam Hampton.
Okay, I'll have a look.
Yeah.
He's the one who asked to record this as well. He was interested in this presentation.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so that would clearly, meet that. But you see that I think, the showering really makes sense, because you see that the reduction really happens in the early times of the day and the later times of the day.
Right, yes. Yeah.
And so, the cooking and showering seems to be the drivers, but I don't know. I need to, it's a bit mysterious. We're trying to, so I'll have a look at what he wrote, because that would, it meets what we see in the data for sure.
I suppose an unknown in this is if there's your policy proposal that be prepared to have your employees doing teleworking. But if you only have employees doing 1 or 2 days a week in the office, you've got them all coming in.
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
the whole office, and
No, I agree. I think you need. I think when I talk to people who work in offices, it's a trend that was starting to happen. So I think it's only accelerated something that, the time spent commuting and the cost was identified as a potential saving. So you could have a rota. You could say, some teams come on some days, and I think I'm curious to see even international travel or flying. I guess the marginal impact is probably way bigger than taking the tube or the car. Just if that will come back, I don't know. But yeah, I think there's going to be a rethink of what work means, the location of work means, and organizations are right now in the middle of trying to figure out that, how do you, I think many are struggling to bring people back to the office because it's quite comfortable to work in PJs.
There's another aspect to this too that I can see, is that one of the reasons that people live so far away from where they work is that housing has moved outside of cities to the edges and so forth, because there was so much business in the center of cities. Now we can probably see a trend that's going to change, in that we will have all of this city business offices, a lot of them moving into being housing people. So you might have people closer to work as well.
Yeah, interesting.
So I'm very curious about how that will develop, because I think so many people are really saying we are fed up traveling to work. We really are fed up traveling. So
I think no, I completely agree.
Can I just add something to that? I think we're seeing a parallel trend also of the increasing shared office space. So where people office, but they won't go to their dedicated office because it might be in London and they might live somewhere else. So that you have this co-working space, or whatever you want to call it, where people just want to be around other people while they're working. So that could kind of disentangle, I guess, the location of your employer from where you actually work and where you commute to. You might actually commute to somewhere else, which is not your work, to
have the engagement with people.
yeah, exactly. Just to be in a working environment.
Because we all know that engagement is what helps balance mental health.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it goes. Yeah, I think it goes both ways. So, depending on the work, we had some of our office space was designed by a very good architect, but who had clearly never done any research. So put loads of open spaces and no one wants to sit there because they feel they work better in isolations. So, but, at the same time, everyone wants to have coffee and tea with others. So, it could go both ways, that being at home is nice because you control your own time and you have your own peace and quiet with kids back at school, etc. But then you don't have the coffee breaks or the water glass in the corridor.
I also wonder about something slightly different. What your findings on gas mean, or what their implications would be for decarbonizing heat. Because behavioral change clearly does not change the carbon intensity, but working from home has reduced how much gas is consumed. And so when we talk about decarbonizing heating, it appears to me that it's unlikely that that's going to be accelerated if it remains cheaper, and behavioral change wouldn't change much in terms of carbon intensity. So what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, so what was I think that it's a bit the same conclusion, that you need the system to change. You can't only rely on behavior. And the problem is that system change means, maybe it's more costly. I don't know. Is it more difficult to achieve? It means, policy-wise, you can't just tell people, well, change your behavior. You need to think more broadly. But I don't know. That's a thought. But I do agree that it was striking that the problem with gas is that your behavior doesn't change. If you were to shower at your lunch break instead of the morning, the carbon content of your gas is the same, and so the margin of behavioral change there is very minimal. What else can you do? I mean, I'm not sure I would want to say, let's all shower less on the road to net zero. You probably, want, and so I think decarbonizing heat has to happen, it won't happen for cost reasons. So it has to happen for other regulation reasons. But I'm not an expert on heat, so I leave you.
It gets very difficult to detach behavior from other aspects with heating. It's a whole sort of practice we engage in with the technologies that are available and the sort of social standards that are available. And yeah, there are sort of margins in that you can have shorter showers. A lot of people could shower less and actually they'd still be fine,
Yeah.
But there's something you can do there. But then there's what's the kind of shower head that you have,
Yeah.
power shower, and
Yeah, so I guess it's a multitude of determinants of your heat use that have. Do you know the study where I think they did a trial where they said they informed people that by reducing their thermostat by 1 degree or 2 degrees, they would save a few pounds, this many pounds a month. And the impact of that information campaign was that people increased their thermostat because they realized it costs so little to be heated more.
But sometimes there are these times of opportunity, like lockdown, when things change dramatically and people see that things can be different. There's also a very nice study talking about showers. It was done in Brazil, but it was an LSE study. And
yes, I know that study, really interesting.
The big drought at the turn of the century. And they found, and so there was a big campaign to get people to use less electricity. And in fact, they kept the demand down. It took more than 10 years to climb back to what it had been. And the main reasons they thought this was people, I think it was setting the thermostat on their shower, the water heating lower, and having shorter showers, I think.
Yeah, I think it was a very interesting study, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was really driven by external factors and people reacting to that.
Yes, that explains something really strange. In most developing countries, a lot of the shower heads, instant shower heads, where instead of heating a boiler, you have an instant shower. Most of them are made in Brazil. So probably that's one of the outcomes. Because you can actually set the temperature of the water on the shower head.
Yeah.
And it only heats, when you're showering. So probably that's one.
Interesting.
Okay, yeah. Right. Yeah. I just one more question, if nobody else is going to come in, Mirabelle. And this was about working with Octopus.
Yeah.
So how ready are Octopus, do you think, for transition? Just managing all the change that's needed in having things like dynamic tariffs, billing, and so on.
Well, what was really interesting is that they are, the way they approach it is that it's just sort of, they try it. They have this customer base, which is quite diverse. So, they have very standard customers that will, I guess, be typical. But then they have a small, which is not so small, customer base that write their own APIs with their smart tariff to, so, very engaged customers. So we specifically chose not to take customers that were on a time of use tariff. But what in our conversations with them, what's interesting is, you say, oh, well, could we look at the data on this or that? And their approach is, we'll just try it and see how people respond. We don't need to. So that they don't have this sort of scientific view of, we need a control group and so on. They just roll it out and see if there's uptake for it. And so I would say
an iterative response.
Yes, exactly.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So, obviously for scientists, you try to say, well, can we just maybe take some that we don't, or, we stagger something. So we still want to, but the thing is, they're so busy. So we were really lucky. It was a window of opportunity, but any communication any exchange of email takes a month to happen because they're growing so fast that they don't have capacity. So I think, they're ready in terms of mindset, because really if you listen to their vision, to how they want the company to work, it's very clear that what they want is a company that is part of the transition, and that they feel, you know, part of that transition is having a demand for electricity that is responsive, that can adapt, etc. But it's not the only thing. I mean, they also just are a company, so it needs to they need to sell things. But I think it is a big shift, because I remember when we started trying to do these types of studies, say with EDF 10 years ago, it was very hard to tell them, well, can we do an RCT that will lead people to consume less energy? You know, that went against their reason to be, you know, no, we want to sell more. And so I think that's been a big shift, and you know, interesting that Octopus is growing so much, is that they're saying, you know, it's not what we're selling isn't electricity only, and therefore we don't want more and more per customer. What we're selling is a service, and the fact that, you know, these customers' data, for example, has value, and the way we optimize things, and the way we can lead to some behavior change has some margins of profit potential there. So, you know, it's great to work with them. Although, you know, I won't. It's not a story of we're talking every day about all potential use of their data. You know, the survey was a one-off, and they're very hard to get hold of. But it's been great to, you know, even be able to look at the data. And even, you know, things like seeing the different patterns during the day, you know, it's not that easy to find in the literature something precise like that. So that was, you know, interesting to look at, and seeing that there is margin for flattening.
Yeah.
I see that their revenue.
Wondering whether they might be the kind of organization. Oh, sorry, Anne.
It's all right. I was just going to make a comment that their revenue in 2020 was 2 billion. And in 2017 it was 35 million. So they're gaining customers and doing very well. Sorry, Colin.
Yeah, I encourage you. There's a podcast by someone called Michael Liebreich. I don't know if you know him.
Oh yes, yeah.
And his podcast is called Cleaning Up. And I find it quite. He's an expert on energy and the economics of it, and the market side of it. And so there's, in one of the podcasts, he interviews the CEO of Octopus, and also there's another one where he interviews Tony Blair, and every week it's quite different, but I find I've an interesting listening to do.
Yeah, he did a really good one with Rachel Kite too.
That one. It's
yes,
yeah.
Sorry, what's his name again? Michael what?
Liebreich, Liebreich, but the podcast is called Cleaning Up.
Okay.
He sits in his room with a pint of beer and has a conversation with people.
Yeah. Well, I've only on the videos. Do you see them? I've been listening.
All right.
Yeah, so that those are good. But yeah, sorry, I think Colin, you had another question.
Yeah, I had another question. So, given that Octopus are so difficult to get hold of, are they the kind of organization that might be open for like KTP funding, like knowledge transfer partnership engagement with universities, where they might feel like they might also benefit from the input of academics rather than seeing it as a kind of a monodirectional information extraction?
Yeah, they are. I mean, they are engaged. I know Imperial at different levels and I'm sure they're growing so fast. I'm sure we're not the only ones that they're really keen. You know, it's not that they say we don't have time for this. You know, they want to engage with universities and
Okay.
and thinking of solutions and so on. So yeah, I definitely encourage you to do that. But I think
It's good to know.
yeah, that there's yeah, we'll see how things go. But yeah, but yeah, if anyone has, I think the part of the data we don't use as much and is the gas data. So if anyone thinks there's something interesting they would like to look at, I'm happy to discuss that. I'm afraid I need to leave to my next meeting.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me. It was great. I'm glad, Anne, you mentioned me.
Yes, we all are.
And well, I hope I can come to Oxford one day. It would be fun.
That'd be good. Thanks a lot.
No, thanks.
Thanks.
Have a nice day.
Thank you too.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.